Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, the future of Captagon.
The UN Office on Drugs and Crime says Syria is the primary source of Captagon in the Middle East. At least it was.
With new Syrian authorities cracking down on this drug, where will production go next? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
Hi, I'm Niko Vorobyov. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm the author of the book Dopeworld, and occasionally I moonlight on Al Jazeera as well.
Niko, it's a pleasure to have you back on The Take.
Thanks for having me. The pleasure is all mine.
Can you just tell me about your book?
Yeah, so it's called Dopeworld, and it's basically about the global war on drugs. And I tried to dress up as something more academic with, data and studies. But really, it's just me being a stoned, drunken hooligan around different corners of the world.
Okay, so we're talking about drugs. Drug stories, they often boil down to supply and demand. And in this case, supply is what's been disrupted, right? Because Syria under Assad was the world's largest supplier of Captagon.
Since the civil war began in 2011, millions of the pills produced under the Assad regime have been shipped to neighboring countries, accounting for 80% of the world's production.
Now Assad is gone, and that's going to have, repercussions, which we'll explore. But before we dig into that, I do want to just touch briefly on the demand side and lay a bit of foundation. So first, at its most basic level, what is Captagon and where is it consumed?
Captagon, it was originally the market name or the brand name for a medication called phenethylene, which was originally developed in Germany in the 60s. And it was kind of like Ritalin or Adderall. So it's kind of to treat narcolepsy, ADHD, conditions like that. Then it wasn't exactly banned, but the physicians around the world were noticing a lot of side effects, the usual sort of side effects that come with stimulants. So that could be like anxiety, heightened anxiety, depression, different mental conditions, like in extreme cases, psychosis. So it wasn't banned, but in the 80s, it was heavily restricted. But by that point, it picked up a following in the Middle East, specifically in the rich Gulf countries, like Saudi Arabia, UAE. And then by that point, it also it became kind of a black market drug. First of all, it's like a party drug. But secondly, it's also like a kind of a cheaper alternative to something like cocaine. I don't know what the current price is, but about 2 or 3 years ago, the price for a Captagon pill was about $10 to $12, whereas in Saudi Arabia, the price per gram of cocaine was just under $300.
Wow.
Yeah, and as well as being like a sort of like a party drug, it's also a kind of a functional drug. So the migrant laborers who might be working in the Gulf, like for example from the Philippines or Nepal or places like that, they'd be taking it, or like the builders on construction sites, like they'd be taking it to work long hours without a break.
I'm just curious, have you seen Captagon up close? I mean, people have an image in their minds of what cocaine or heroin looks like, how it's consumed, where it's consumed. Paint us a picture of Captagon use.
So Captagon, it's I saw it in Beirut, Lebanon when I was there. I've been there a couple of times. And they're like small tablets, and they all had like double C's, like the CC logo. Some people call it like the double crescent logo. And yeah, basically, I won't lie, I did try Captagon once in the name of science. It completely killed my appetite, but at the same time, I did also feel very confident, very, very alert at the time. So you can see how that might be useful in a battlefield situation, for example.
And so have you ever seen like the harmful effects up close?
I was working with some local charities there, NGOs who work with people with drug dependence issues. And they told me quite a lot about that. Comes with a whole bunch of its own risks. It can be highly addictive, can lead to serious heart complications, can lead to psychosis in some cases, the stereotypical kind of bugs under your skin thing.
Okay. All right. So moving on. The Captagon numbers are just huge. The World Bank estimated the annual value of the Captagon trade at $5.6 billion, and that's just for Syria. But that's changing, and that's why we're talking to you today. The new interim government in Syria made a big show of cracking down on these Captagon labs.
This used to be a factory that made potato chips. Assad took it by force and turned it into a Captagon facility that was run by a businessman and a member of parliament.
Why was the Assad regime so heavily involved in the Captagon trade in the first place?
So first of all, Syria has been for throughout the 20th century, even has been an important hub for narco trafficking. So back in the old days of the French connection. So they'd have poppy farmers growing opium in eastern Turkey. That would pass through Syria, be processed into morphine, and then shipped out through Lebanon into France, and then from France into the United States. But it mushroomed basically during the Lebanese civil war, when the Syrian government, by now Assad's government, Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar, his troops occupied the Bekaa Valley, which is the main drug-producing area of Lebanon. At the time, it was mainly marijuana and opium/heroin that was being made there.
And wine.
And wine also, yeah. So I see someone's been to the vineyards. So yeah, so they've had their fingers in those pies for a while. However, what happened with the Syrian civil war, there's a kind of like the perfect storm. So before the war, Syria had a huge like domestic pharmaceutical industry. So like the equipment and the know-how was already there to be repurposed. Secondly, you had the sanctions. So it was very hard for Syria, both from like Western countries, and also Syria was kicked out of the Arab League as well. So it was like Syria's legitimate exports like fell massively. So obviously they had to find some way of making up for this lack of revenue. And also to an extent, all the sides in the Syrian civil war were taking Captagon pills as kind of like a pet pill. So that's something we see a lot of just throughout war, soldiers taking drugs for morale reasons, to keep them fighting. And that happened in Syria as well on all sides. So to an extent, it was also supplying their own army.
Right. Okay. So just unpack some of that stuff. It sounds like you're saying there were armed groups, and then the regime took control of the Captagon trade. And because there were sanctions imposed, sanctions often drive regimes into illicit activity. And then they started to make money through the state-sanctioned distribution and production of Captagon.
Yeah, I think it's quite hard to pinpoint to the extent they were all directly involved, but I mean, we can see obviously the videos of the Captagon factories that the new government is showing around. So they were definitely like, if they weren't like directly facilitating it, like German investigators have alleged, there are some gang lords, basically crime bosses in Syria, and to get their loyalty, the government looked the other way, allowed them to do drug smuggling in exchange for their life. From what we understand, it goes quite high up. So maybe not Bashar al-Assad himself, but his brother Maher, the commander of the 4th Division of the army. So he's been implicated in a lot of the Captagon traffic, and it was his forces which had the control over the major Mediterranean seaboards as well. So that gave them the pathway to actually export it.
More with Niko after the break. So the fall of the Assad regime is this big blow to the industry, right? But as you know, drug markets are very resilient. So how is the market transforming now that the Assad regime has fallen?
I think it's still a little bit too early to say how the market is transformed. I mean, we're definitely seeing that the new government of Syria, they're making a big show of taking down the labs, like showing news reporters the labs. This kind of industry, obviously, it doesn't disappear overnight. The new government, it's made from a coalition of different armed groups that were fighting the government. So I'm sure some of them had some interest in Captagon themselves that hasn't fully gone away. And even if they didn't, in Europe, governments aren't so much in cahoots with drug traffickers openly, but drug trafficking still exists, right? So it's still going to exist to some extent. I think it is a major blow to the Captagon industry now that one of the big kind of state actors is being taken out of the picture, of course. But I think, that what will basically happen is the demand is still there. It's a supply and demand issue, right? So as long as there's profit in it, someone's going to try to make bank.
There are other countries where the production could move to. Have you identified any places where that might pick up the slack now that Syria's out, or if Syria's out?
Yeah, I mean, for pretty much the same amount of time that there were Captagon factories in Syria, there were Captagon factories in Lebanon as well. And even if the Lebanese weren't making Captagon at some period, then they were helping the Syrians export it because there wasn't as much attention towards Lebanese exports as Syrian exports. So I think the one thing that could happen is because the demand is still there, people still want to buy Captagon. People still want to get high. So I was talking to a Lebanese narco from the Bekaa Valley, the ones that used to grow marijuana and poppy back in the 80s. So now they've diversified their portfolios to Captagon. And basically he was saying, I have his quote here.
This kind of trade is impossible to stop. When you pay money, you can smuggle anything you want as much as you want. We used to pay huge amounts of our profits to the officers of the Assad regime, but now things will be easier and we will prosper.
So basically, he's just happy he doesn't have to bribe any Syrian generals anymore. He can keep it all in-house.
What about Iraq? Is that a possible destination for production?
Yeah, I mean, there are several other places where the Captagon industry might relocate. One of them is indeed Iraq, which has its own steadily growing crystal meth issue, and where there are lots of irregular armed groups, a lot of them backed by Iran. But the thing to remember is like a lot of what passes for Captagon these days is actually just meth. And there's meth being made everywhere, all over the world. Iran is another source of meth. Nigeria, Afghanistan's making a lot more meth now. So the Taliban famously had their anti-drug campaign. They were quite successful in destroying the poppy fields to make opium and heroin. But the thing is, the way meth is made in Afghanistan, it's made using the ephedra shrub, which just grows in the wild. So it's not like there's a specific location you can pinpoint to target. And what happens is
the ephedra shrub. So ephedrine comes from a shrub called ephedra?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can make organic 100% green meth.
Wow.
It just takes a kind of a longer process, but that's how meth's being made in Afghanistan.
Just out of curiosity, Niko, in a place like Latin America, say Colombia or Mexico, and other places where there's a strong connection between this drugs and violence, why don't we see this violence in the Middle East and in the Captagon trade?
Well, originally we did back in the Lebanese civil war, but the drug trade isn't necessarily violent. And I think one reason why it wasn't like the Captagon trade recently wasn't so violent is because there's basically one group controlling it. And this one group had state backing, and this state backing was from Syria. So maybe what might happen now is the Captagon trade might actually get more violent now that the sort of the patrons are out of the picture.
Wow.
Maybe.
Wow.
It's a possibility, depending where the industry moves to.
Well, I mean, that's exactly why we're talking. Usually when there's a big disruption in a drug market, bad things happen. So we're trying to just sort of get in front of that.
Yeah, I mean, actually, if you look at Mexico, Mexico was actually a relatively peaceful place until the late 90s or so, especially compared to the United States. But at the time, Mexico wasn't really a democracy. They only started democratizing towards the late 90s. And as they democratized, the old kind of pacts between like the mafia and the military and different politicians started falling apart or going into flux, which is one of the reasons why Mexico is such a bloody mess now. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's kind of, it'll be interesting. Maybe horrific to see what'll happen with the Captagon industry in that regard now that the state mafia connection is broken there.
Well, yeah, but that's the concern. Will it find a new state, right? Captagon has been jumping around from one place to another, Eastern Europe to the Levant, now back to Lebanon, or maybe even Iraq. I mean, how can governments ensure that drugs don't create new narco states? Like, how can a place like Iraq defend itself if there's all this money to be made and a vacuum?
Well, this is my personal opinion, but I think just in general, we should really reconsider our global drug policies, like on a global scale. One of the world leaders who is pushing for this is Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia. And he was basically saying that the civil war in Colombia, which has been ongoing since the 60s, it could be over tomorrow if we ended the prohibition on cocaine. If there was some way, for example, to have it dispensed on a prescription basis through pharmacies, for example. Because, as long as the demand's still there, then it's going to be hard to account for all the unstable or weak or corrupt governments. And it's going to keep happening with disastrous side effects in terms of corruption and public health and safety. Government should embrace more the idea of harm reduction. Harm reduction, it's not like stopping people from using drugs, because that's going to happen anyway. Someone's not going to choose to... You can't force someone to stop taking drugs. Like if you put someone through detox, like forcible detox, the underlying psychological issues are still there. So they have to want it on their own. So until they do, the best thing we can do is keep them alive and try to minimize the risks. So, for example, in the case of Captagon and other stimulants, that would be improving access to psychiatric care and removing the stigma, so people won't feel as ashamed, to get help.
Okay, Captagon. Ending on that. So 10 years from now, which do you think is more likely, that Captagon has taken over the world, it's expanded into Asia, North America, everyone's talking about Captagon, or it's forgotten, it's been basically supplanted by meth, and it's remembered only as a footnote made possible by the unique circumstances of the Syrian civil war?
I think that people probably remember it mostly as a phase, and it's just gonna become one of the many variations of synthetic drugs plaguing our bodies in the 21st century. I think, maybe one day some old timer will be talking to some young whippersnapper. Oh, back in my day, we had the Captagon with the 2 C's. Now those were some real drugs. But it's just going to be some weird form of nostalgia, I think.
Wow. All right. Niko, thank you for coming on The Take.
Thank you very much for having me.
And that's The Take. We really want to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Do you think the war on drugs has gone too far? Have you heard about harm reduction? What do you want to talk about? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll be reading them closely. I will be reading through them. So we'll see you tomorrow.